You can support me by turning on notifications, subscribing to my channel, and liking the video. Waiting for your comments. The bloody hidden story of Snow White. Snow White is often remembered as a gentle, innocent fairy tale, complete with cheerful dwarfs, a charming prince, and a singing princess whose kindness ultimately conquers evil. The Walt Disney adaptation from 1937 cemented this sweet imagery. A wholesome young girl running through the forest, singing with woodland creatures, and sharing a cottage with 7 delightful dwarfs. Yet peel back the layers of sugar-coated folklore, and you'll find a much darker narrative lurking in the shadows. The older, bloodier versions of Snow White are filled with terrifying twists. Malevolent queens who demand gruesome trophies, huntsmen caught in moral dilemmas, and a child's life in danger for the pettiest of reasons. This older tale, shaped by medieval harshness and reworked by the Brothers Grimm in the 19th century, stands as a testament that fairy tales were not always intended for bedtime comfort. Instead, they served as stark moral lessons, filled with violence and drama that would frighten even modern audiences. In exploring the hidden, bloody story of Snow White, we step back in time to examine how a simple fable could become so steeped in terror, and how shifting cultural norms have sanitized a once grisly parable into the bright, musical narrative we know today. If you only know the Disney version of Snow White, you might be surprised at just how drastically the Brothers Grimm version differs from the cartoon. Published in their 1812 collection, this older form of the story depicts a mother envious of her daughter's beauty, a theme reminiscent of primal vanity that can tip even family bonds into cruelty. Over time, later editions change the mother into a stepmother, possibly to soften the brutality of a mother hatching a plan to murder her own child. Still, the impetus remained the same. A regal woman consumed by jealousy so intense that she would commit murder. In some retellings, the mother demands the huntsman cut out Snow White's lungs and liver as proof of the girl's demise, so that she can devour these organs and presumably absorb her daughter's purity or beauty. This macabre detail, absent from Disney's sanitized version, was once central to the story. It provided a glimpse of the underlying violence in these old folk tales, where cannibalism, murder, and dark magic often formed the backbone of cautionary morals. Perhaps one of the most grotesque elements is precisely that, the evil queen demanding a literal token of Snow White's death. In many modern adaptations, including Disney's, the huntsman is told to return with the girl's heart. The older Brothers Grimm text, however, has references to the lungs and liver of Snow White, which the queen intends to cook with salt and eat, reveling in the hideous notion that devouring her rival's organs would grant some twisted satisfaction or a claim to further magical powers. The huntsman, overcome by pity, cannot follow through with the deed. Instead, he kills a boar and delivers those organs to the queen, who feasts upon them unsuspectingly. This savage feast underscores how violence and cannibalistic undertones found their way into bedtime stories, functioning as raw, unvarnished examples of moral transgression. Yet the tale doesn't end with that grim subterfuge. We might recall Snow White fleeing into the forest, meeting 7 dwarfs, and living in a picturesque cottage. But the forest itself, in older versions, was no gentle kingdom of singing birds. It was dark, menacing, a labyrinth that tested the mind and courage of anyone passing through. Snow White's flight represented more than a moment of fleeing danger. It was a symbolic descent into a realm of wildness and primal fear. The dwarfs, too, weren't necessarily the cheerful band of singing miners. In many retellings, these dwarfs act as strict guardians, insisting that Snow White keep house or do chores to earn her keep. They provide safety but demand obedience, forging a relationship far more transactional than the playful atmosphere seen in the Disney film. Their presence in the story has led to centuries of speculation. Are they spirits of the forest, personifications of the 7 deadly sins, or simply ordinary dwarfs in a mining settlement who happen to take pity on a lost princess? Regardless, the older versions depict them as suspicious or even stern, reinforcing that this was a rough environment with uncertain alliances. The iconic poison apple scene remains the best-known element of the Snow White tale. The Brothers Grimm story is quite gruesome here as well. The evil queen disguises herself multiple times, first using a tight lace for Snow White's bodice, nearly strangling her. Snow White is saved by the dwarfs who cut the lace. The second attempt involves a poisoned comb thrust into her hair, which again nearly kills the girl. Only on the third try, with the fateful apple, does the queen succeed in leaving Snow White in a state of apparent death. Interestingly, some versions of the legend mention only the single attempt with the apple, while others detail these multiple cunning ruses to emphasize the queen's relentlessness. Each scheme grows more horrifying, and the queen's hatred intensifies with each failure. By the third attempt, we're confronted by the horrifying image of a naive young woman trusting an old crone, biting into a piece of fruit that dooms her into a death-like sleep. The dwarfs find her too late, and they cannot revive her with any known remedy. This leads to the infamous glass coffin, placed on a hillside, so that the dwarfs might guard it perpetually, loving her so fiercely they refuse to bury her. In some older tellings, the coffin is displayed in a forest clearing, where animals gather in vigil, and travelers stumble upon it in awe and pity. One of the biggest differences from the Disney version lies in how Snow White is awakened. In the cartoon, the prince bestows a true love's kiss, breaking the spell. But historically, the Brothers Grimm offered a more startling approach. The prince becomes so entranced by Snow White's beauty that he begs the dwarfs to let him take her coffin. While transporting it, one of the servants carrying the coffin stumbles, dislodging the piece of poisoned apple from Snow White's throat. She awakes, confused and frightened. This twist is far less romantic. No magical kiss, no direct demonstration of love, just a jolt that dislodges the poison. Some renditions interpret the scene as the prince's servants growing frustrated at the weight of the coffin, even dropping it, ironically giving Snow White the breath of life. The raw physicality of that approach is a far cry from a fairy tale's gentle act of love. But the Grimm touches don't stop at Snow White's revival. The Brothers Grimm ended their story with a gruesome punishment for the evil queen. Invited to Snow White's wedding to the prince, the queen is presented with a pair of iron shoes that have been heated in a fire until they glow red hot. She is forced to put these scalding shoes on and dance until she collapses or dies, effectively suffering a torturous end for her crimes. This horrifying detail was meant as moral retribution. Typical of older European folklore, a wicked villain deserves savage justice. In the Disney film, of course, the queen plummets off a cliff, presumably meeting her end in a storm. But the older version's punishment is unrelenting in its brutality. A scene so disturbing that one wonders how it ever became part of a child's story at all. Yet that moment, as bizarre as it might seem today, reminds us that fairy tales once functioned as cautionary narratives. Evil is met with grotesque comeuppance, no matter how extreme. So, why were these violent elements included in such stories? Historically, fairy tales were less about lulling children to sleep and more about instilling moral or social lessons. They were told communally, not exclusively to kids, and the harshness of life in medieval and early modern Europe often seeped into these narratives. Themes of betrayal, envy, violence, and redemption served as both entertainment and a moral compass, warning that vanity, cruelty, or disobedience leads to dire results. Over time, as cultural attitudes changed, many folk stories underwent revision, especially once authors like Charles Perrault and later the Brothers Grimm began to compile them in a more standardized written form. The Grimms themselves modified their stories across multiple editions, sometimes toning down the gore depending on public sentiment. For Snow White, the shift from mother to stepmother was just one example. The queen's cannibalistic feast of lungs and liver gradually receded into the background, overshadowed by a simpler mention of a heart, or left out altogether in children's picture books. By the time Walt Disney adopted the story, Hollywood style demanded a gentler tone. The huntsman's murder plot and the queen's monstrous cunning remained, but the emphasis was on comedic dwarfs and musical cheer. Still, the chilling undertones are not so easily erased. Even in the Disney film, the huntsman's trembling fear, the queen's transformation into a witch-like hag, and the terror of the poisoned apple sequence offer flickers of the story's dark origin. Some viewers, especially younger children, find those scenes quite unsettling. Perhaps it is what lends Snow White its enduring power. Beneath the veneer of sweetness lies an ancient archetype, a primal fear of betrayal by those closest to us, be it family or someone who should protect us. The queen's envy resonates as a timeless caution. Vanity has destructive consequences, and innocence doesn't always equate to safety. In the older versions, Snow White is a powerless figure, rescued only by happenstance. She is a pawn in a savage game orchestrated by adult cruelty and primal appetites. Legends swirl around the idea that Snow White might have been based on a real historical figure. For instance, some associate the tale with Margaretha von Waldeck, a 16th-century German noblewoman whose father owned copper mines, employing dwarf children as laborers. Another claim references Maria Sophia Margaretha Katharina von Erthel, a baron's daughter whose stepmother apparently disliked her. The magic mirror might have been connected to a mirror factory in the region. Such theories are hard to confirm, but they highlight how local tragedies and real historical individuals could have blended into a mythic story, eventually emerging as a fairy tale. If that's so, the brutal elements, attempts at murder, forced labor, or suspicious deaths, could reflect real events, amplifying the darkness at the narrative's heart. Comparing these original, bloodier versions to the glimmering Disney portrayal reveals how cultural adaptation shapes a story to different audiences. The cartoon focuses on comedic dwarfs, playful animals, and an uplifting message. With unwavering kindness, Snow White wins out. The more ancient text warns that the world can be a place of horrific acts, where a mother might turn cannibal, devouring the essence of her own child. It's no wonder that generation after generation has re-edited Snow White, smoothing away rough edges or ramping up moral lessons. Modern retellings, spin-off novels, and reimagined stage plays sometimes resurrect the darker traits, weaving them into horror or adult fantasy contexts that emphasize how twisted the queen's hatred truly is. Even so, the tale remains one of the most famous in the entire fairy tale canon. Something about Snow White's innocence, the dwarf's unique personalities, and the queen's obsession has resonated for centuries. We find references in popular culture, television, film, theater, and literature, where Snow White's image is reinvented as everything from a comedic princess to a vengeful warrior. But when we peer back into its origin, we come face to face with the brutal truths behind the facade. A mother's jealousy so overwhelming that it drives her to commit murder, huntsmen lured into betrayal, cannibalistic feasts that bring no relief, punishments so horrific they rival the worst nightmares. That such a story ever made its way into children's libraries might seem bizarre, yet it underscores that fairy tale once carried darker connotations than the sanitized versions we often see. In re-examining the bloody hidden story of Snow White, we're reminded that fairy tales speak to primal fears and hopes. The terror of a mother's envy, the flight into an unknown forest, the helplessness of a young girl facing lethal peril. These elements echo universal concerns about betrayal and survival. The dwarfs' ambiguous role, part benefactors, part stern housemates, showcases the complexity of alliances in folk tales. The Queen's final dance in red-hot iron shoe stands as a dire promise that evil will meet a shocking, albeit symbolically satisfying, end. Although modern audiences may balk at the brutality, the old accounts rarely flinch from illustrating humanity's capacity for cruelty. By forging Snow White's story in such violent terms, the Brothers Grimm and their medieval predecessors established a moral record. Vanity is dangerous. Innocence needs allies, and children must beware manipulative adults. Today, we might prefer more uplifting narratives, but the old ghosts remain in the shadows, whispering that fairy tales once portrayed a crueler reality. Should you revisit Snow White with these grisly details in mind, the entire narrative changes color. The huntsman's trembling knife, the queen's monstrous hunger, the dwarf's murky motivations, the glass coffin that doubles as a shrine to lost innocence. The violence fades in modern retellings, replaced by soft lullabies or comedic subplots, yet the bare bones remain if we only look deeper. Perhaps that's why the Disney films still unsettle some viewers when the queen transforms or the forest grows dark, a latent echo of the raw terror that shaped the older forms. In that sense, Snow White endures not just as a charming princess in a bright dress, but also as a relic from an era when tales were cautionary laments about envy, deception, and blood. Yes, the story can have a happy ending. Snow White awakens. The queen meets retribution, but not without stepping through a maze of potential horrors. The next time you recall the mirror that uttered the dreaded words, fairest of them all, consider the savage undercurrent of this seemingly harmless question. For in the older, blood-soaked fable, a moment of vanity spirals into homicide, savage feasting, and a scorching punishment. The happily ever after might be real for Snow White, but it is earned through near-death betrayal and unimaginable cruelty. Ultimately, these hidden layers of darkness don't merely serve to shock. They remind us that fairy tales, at their origin, were never purely sweet lullabies. Instead, they hold a mirror to human nature, where fear, revenge, and blood can surface in the pursuit of beauty and power, ensuring that the name Snow White remains etched not just in childhood dreams, but in the nightmares lurking beneath them.